Before kingdoms rose and fell, before wars ravaged nations, before humanity spread across the earth, there was a field. In that field, the ground drank its first taste of human blood, and the sky witnessed a crime that would echo through all generations. This is not a story of strangers or enemies. This is the story of two brothers, born to the first man and woman, who brought into the world something that had never existed before: murder. Imagine a world where death by human hands was unknown, where the very concept of killing your own flesh and blood didn't exist. Now imagine being the one to introduce it. His name was Cain, the firstborn of humanity, a farmer who worked the cursed ground outside paradise. He made an offering to God, but it was rejected. His brother Abel's offering accepted. What happened next changed humanity forever. Why did God reject Cain's sacrifice? What drove a man to raise his hand against his own brother? And what was the mysterious mark that God placed upon him? A brand that protected the very murderer who deserved death. This is the story of Cain, the man who killed, the man who lied to God's face, and the man cursed to wander the earth forever. The world had never seen a human birth before. Adam and Eve, now living outside the garden they once called home, were about to experience something completely new. Eve went through labor, something no woman had ever experienced, and brought forth a son. Genesis chapter 4 verse 1 tells us what happened. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. When Eve held her baby for the first time, she gave him a name that reflected her feelings. Cain, which means acquired or gotten. She believed God had given her this child, a gift despite everything that had happened in Eden. This was humanity's first child, born not in paradise, but in a world that was now marked by difficulty and pain. Eve didn't know it yet, but this boy would make history in the worst possible way. Adam and Eve looked at their son with hope. They had lost so much when they were expelled from the garden. They had lost their perfect home, their easy life, and their close walk with God. But now they had gained something, a child, a new generation. Perhaps they wondered if this boy might be special, might somehow be part of God's promise to defeat the serpent that had deceived them. When God had pronounced judgment on the serpent back in the garden, he had said in Genesis 3:15, And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Maybe Eve thought Cain could be that promised seed. The first baby's cry echoed in a world that had never heard such a sound. Adam, who had been created fully grown, now watched a tiny, helpless human grow and develop. This child needed constant care, constant feeding, constant protection. Parenthood was another new experience in this fallen world, another challenge that came with both joy and difficulty. Cain grew up in a world his parents often talked about, but he never saw. Adam and Eve would tell him stories about the garden, about trees that gave fruit without effort, about walking with God in the cool of the day, about a life where work was joy and not burden. But Cain's reality was completely different. He knew only the world outside Eden's gates, a world where everything was harder than it should have been. The ground Cain walked on was cursed. This wasn't just a story his father told him. It was something he experienced every single day. When God had judged Adam, he had said in Genesis 3:17-19, Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Cain saw this curse with his own eyes. The soil fought back against every seed planted. Weeds grew faster than crops. Thorns tore at his hands. Adam taught Cain how to work the land, how to plant seeds and tend crops. It was hard work, the kind that made your back ache and your hands bleed. Sweat dripped from Cain's face as he tilled the soil, just as God had said would happen to Adam. But Cain was good at it. He learned the rhythms of planting and harvest. He learned which plants grew best in which soil. He learned to read the weather, to understand when rain was coming, to know when the time was right to sow seeds into the ground. As Cain grew from a boy into a man, he became skilled at coaxing food from the reluctant earth. He knew when to plant and when to harvest. He understood the soil and the seasons. The work was difficult, exhausting even, but he took pride in what he could produce. His hands grew calloused and strong. His arms became muscular from swinging the tools that broke up the hard ground. His fields, though requiring constant effort, yielded grain and vegetables and fruit. Cain was a farmer through and through. Every day Cain went out to his fields. Every day he fought against the thorns and thistles. Every day he worked until his body ached and sweat soaked his clothes. This was his life, his identity, his contribution to the family. While his father Adam also worked the ground, Cain became even more dedicated to it, more skilled at it. Farming wasn't just what he did. It was who he was. Cain wasn't alone for long. Genesis 4:2 tells us simply, "And she again bare his brother Abel." Eve gave birth to a second son, and this time she named him Abel, a name that means breath or vapor, something temporary and fleeting. It's interesting that she chose this name, though we don't know exactly why. Perhaps she had learned something about the fragility of life in this fallen world. Perhaps she had become less optimistic after seeing how hard life was outside Eden. The two brothers grew up together, but they were different from the start. The same verse tells us about their different paths, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. While Cain followed in his father's footsteps, working the fields and fighting against the cursed soil, Abel chose a different direction. He became a shepherd, watching over flocks of sheep and goats. We don't know why Abel made this choice, but it set him on a completely different life path from his older brother. Abel spent his days in the open country with his animals. He led them to fresh pasture and protected them from danger. He knew each sheep by sight, understood their needs, cared for them when they were sick or injured. He helped with births when the ewes gave birth to lambs. He protected the flock from predators, wild animals that would gladly kill a sheep if given the chance. His life was mobile, moving from place to place as the flocks needed fresh grass and water. It was a gentler occupation than Cain's constant battle with the ground, but it had its own challenges and demands. The brothers saw each other regularly, but their daily lives were quite different. Cain stayed close to home, tied to his fields that required constant attention. You couldn't leave crops unattended for long. Weeds would take over, animals would eat the plants, pests would destroy the harvest. Abel wandered with his flocks, sleeping under the stars, moving wherever the sheep needed to go. Cain's work was about making things grow from the earth, forcing life from cursed soil. Abel's work was about protecting and nurturing living creatures that God had already created. Both were important. Both were necessary. Both brothers were providing for their family in their own way. They needed what each other produced: Cain's grain and vegetables and fruit, Abel's meat and wool and milk. The family depended on both of them. There was no reason for competition or jealousy. They each had their role, their contribution, their value. Adam and Eve had taught their sons something crucial: how to approach God. Even though they had been cast out of Eden, even though they couldn't walk with God in the garden anymore, they could still worship Him. They could still bring offerings. They could still seek His presence. This practice of sacrifice became part of the family's spiritual life, a regular rhythm, just like planting and harvesting, just like tending the flocks. We don't know all the details of how Adam learned about sacrifice, but we know that God had killed animals to make clothes for Adam and Eve, back in Genesis 3:21. Unto Adam also and to his wife did the Lord God make coats of skins and clothe them. Blood had been shed to cover their shame and nakedness. Perhaps this is where the concept of sacrifice began, the understanding that approaching God required something to be given, something precious to be offered, something that cost you dearly. Cain and Abel grew up understanding that they needed to bring offerings to the Lord. This wasn't optional. This wasn't something you did only when you felt like it. This was how you honored God, how you acknowledged that everything you had came from Him, how you thanked Him for life and provision. It was a way of saying thank you, a way of staying connected to the Creator, even though humanity now lived separated from His immediate presence in the garden. It was a way of maintaining relationship with the God who had made them. The time came for the brothers to bring their offerings. Genesis 4:3 begins the account, and in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. This phrase, in process of time, tells us this wasn't a spontaneous decision. This was a regular practice, something they had done before and would do again. It was part of the rhythm of their lives, as natural as planting and harvesting, as normal as tending the flocks. There was an appointed time, a set season when offerings were brought to the Lord. Both brothers knew this time was coming. They had time to prepare, time to think about what they would bring, time to select their offerings carefully. This wasn't a surprise. They weren't caught off guard. They both had the opportunity to bring their best, to approach God with reverence and proper preparation. When the appointed time arrived, Cain went to his fields to select his offering. He gathered produce from the crops he had worked so hard to grow. The verse says he brought of the fruit of the ground, the harvest that represented months of his labor, his sweat, his constant battle against the cursed soil. This was what he knew, what he had, what made sense to him as a farmer. We need to understand what this meant for Cain. These weren't just vegetables or grain sitting in a basket. This was the product of his life's work. Every kernel of wheat, every piece of fruit, every vegetable represented hours of backbreaking effort. He had plowed the hard ground, breaking up the soil that fought against him. He had pulled out thorns with bleeding hands, the very thorns God had cursed the ground to produce. He had planted seeds with aching muscles, bending over row after row. He had watered in times of drought. He had weeded constantly, fighting the thistles that tried to choke out his crops. He had waited through the growing season, hoping for a good harvest. And finally, the harvest had come. Cain brought this produce as his offering to God. It made sense to him. He was a farmer, so he brought what farmers produce. Abel was a shepherd, so Abel would bring what shepherds have. This seemed logical, appropriate, fair. This was his gift, his contribution, his worship. He arranged the fruits and vegetables, presenting to God the work of his hands. In his mind, this was appropriate. This was what he had to give. He had worked hard for it, and now he was giving some of it back to God. But there's something the Bible doesn't tell us that becomes important later. It doesn't say Cain brought the first fruits of his harvest. It doesn't say he brought the best of his crops. It doesn't say he carefully selected the finest produce. It simply says he brought of the fruit of the ground. This small detail, what the verse doesn't say, matters more than we might think at first. When you love someone, when you truly want to honor someone, you don't just give anything. You don't grab whatever is convenient. You give your best. You give what costs you something. Throughout the Bible, God would later command his people to bring the first fruits of their harvest, the best of what they produced. But Cain apparently didn't do this. He brought some of his produce, but not necessarily the first or the best. Maybe he kept the best for himself and his family. Maybe he didn't think it mattered that much. Maybe he saw the offering as an obligation to fulfill rather than an opportunity to honor God with his finest. Abel also prepared his offering, but he did something different. Genesis 4:4 tells us exactly what he brought. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. Notice the specific words here, Not just any sheep, not whatever was convenient, not the weakest or oldest animal that he wouldn't miss. He brought the firstlings, the firstborn of his flock, the first and the best, and not just the animals, but the fat thereof, the richest, most valuable portions. This wasn't a casual offering. Abel had chosen carefully and intentionally. The firstborn animals were always considered the most precious. They represented the beginning of the flock's increase, the promise of future growth. Every shepherd knew that the firstborn was special. These were the animals you would normally want to keep to build your flock. But Abel gave them to God. He didn't hold back. He didn't give God his leftovers or his second best. He gave the finest he had. The fat portions were the best parts, the richest and most valued. In the ancient world, fat was not seen as something negative. It was prized, valuable, the richest part of the animal. When Abel offered the fat thereof, he was giving the premium portions, the parts that would have been most delicious, most nourishing, most desired. He was giving God the absolute best, holding nothing back. There's something else important about Abel's offering. It required blood to be shed. You couldn't offer a living sheep and take it back home afterward. The animal had to be killed. This was a sacrifice in the truest sense of the word. Something had to die. Blood had to be poured out. Life had to be given. Abel understood that approaching God wasn't cheap or easy. He understood that worship required a real cost, a real sacrifice, a real giving up of something precious. Abel brought his offering with a different heart than his brother. While Cain brought produce from his fields, the work of his hands, the fruit of his own labor, Abel brought living creatures, the best of what God had blessed him with. While Cain offered the fruit of cursed ground, Abel offered blood and life. The difference in their offerings revealed something deeper, a difference in their hearts, in how they understood worship, in how they approached the holy God. Abel came with faith, with reverence, with a genuine desire to honor God properly. Then something happened that changed everything. God responded to their offerings, but not in the way Cain expected. Genesis 4:4-5 records what happened. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. God looked at Abel's offering with favor. The word respect here means God regarded it, accepted it, received it with pleasure. Abel's sacrifice was pleasing to the Lord. His worship was accepted. There may have been a visible sign, perhaps fire from heaven consuming the offering, or some other clear indication that God was pleased. We see this pattern later in Scripture where God sends fire to consume offerings he accepts. However it happened, Abel knew without doubt that his offering had been received. God was pleased, the worship was acceptable. But when God looked at Cain's offering, he did not have the same response. There was no acceptance, no sign of pleasure, no indication that the offering was received. Cain's sacrifice was rejected. The text says, God had not respect to both Cain and his offering. This wasn't just about the produce he brought. This was about Cain himself. God saw something in Cain's heart that made the offering unacceptable. The offering and the person bringing it were both rejected together. This must have been devastating for Cain to witness. Imagine standing there with your brother, both of you bringing your offerings, and then seeing God accept his, but reject yours. Everyone present would have known. There was no hiding it. The difference was clear and public. Abel's offering was consumed or accepted in some visible way. Cain's offering just sat there, unaccepted, rejected. Why was Abel's offering accepted and Cain's rejected? The Bible doesn't give us all the details right here in Genesis, but later scriptures help us understand. Hebrews 11:4 explains, By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. It was about faith. It was about the heart behind the offering. Abel came with faith, trusting in God, offering his best with a right heart. Cain's offering lacked this faith, this proper heart attitude, this genuine reverence. The rejection wasn't arbitrary or unfair. God doesn't play favorites. He doesn't randomly choose to accept one person and reject another for no reason. He was looking at what the offerings revealed about each brother's heart. Abel's sacrifice showed reverence, faith, and a willingness to give the very best, to hold nothing back, to approach God on God's terms. Cain's offering showed something less, perhaps pride in his own work, perhaps a casual attitude toward worship, perhaps a heart that wanted to approach God on his own terms rather than God's terms. Perhaps Cain saw the offering as a religious duty to check off rather than a sacred opportunity to honor the Creator. God was teaching an important lesson that would echo through all of Scripture. He doesn't just want our gifts, He wants our hearts. He doesn't just want our religious activities. He wants genuine faith and worship. You can bring the most expensive offering in the world, but if your heart isn't right, if you're not coming in faith, if you're just going through the motions, God won't accept it. He looks past the external gift to the internal attitude. He sees what we really think about Him, how we really value Him, whether we truly honor Him or just pretend to. Cain's response to the rejection revealed what was really in his heart. Genesis 4:5 continues, "And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell." He didn't respond with humility or self-examination. He didn't ask God what was wrong or how he could make it right. He didn't look at Abel's example and try to learn from it. Instead, he became angry, not just annoyed or disappointed, but very wroth, intensely furious, burning with rage. His face showed what was happening inside him. His countenance fell. His expression changed, darkened, fell into a scowl. The joy and reverence that should have accompanied worship completely disappeared, replaced by visible anger and resentment. Everyone could see it. His parents could see it. Abel could see it. God could see it. The darkness in his heart was now written plainly on his face. He made no effort to hide his rage. This is where Cain's story takes its dark turn. He had a choice in this moment. He could have humbled himself. He could have asked God for guidance. He could have learned from Abel's example. He could have examined his own heart and offering to see what was wrong. He could have repented and promised to do better next time, to bring his best, to come with the right attitude. But instead, he let the anger grow. He nursed the resentment. He allowed the jealousy to take root deep in his soul. He chose the path of bitterness rather than the path of repentance. The rejection of his offering became a wound in Cain's pride. He had worked so hard in those cursed fields. He had sweated and struggled and bled to produce that harvest. His hands were calloused from the work. His back ached from the labor. And now God was telling him it wasn't good enough, that it wasn't accepted, that something was wrong with him and his offering. Worse, his younger brother, Abel, who just watched sheep all day, whose work seemed easier, had his offering accepted with favor. In Cain's mind, this was unfair. This was wrong. This was an insult he couldn't bear. Why should Abel be accepted and not him? Cain was the older brother. Cain was the firstborn. Cain worked harder, fought against cursed ground every day. What made Abel so special? What made Abel's sheep better than his grain? The questions burned in his mind, but they were the wrong questions. He should have been asking what was wrong with his own heart, his own attitude, his own approach to God. But pride kept him from seeing the truth. His anger burned, and his face showed the dangerous darkness that was growing in his heart. The fallen countenance was a warning sign, a visible indicator that something was seriously wrong inside. Anger was taking control. Jealousy was spreading like poison. Resentment was building toward his brother, and Cain was choosing to feed these feelings rather than fight them. He was choosing to blame God and Abel rather than examine himself. He was choosing the path that would lead to tragedy. God saw what was happening in Cain's heart. He saw the anger burning, the jealousy growing, the darkness spreading. And instead of leaving Cain to his rage, God came to him. The Lord spoke directly to Cain, asking him a question that was meant to make him think, to make him examine himself. Genesis 4:6 records what God said. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? These were simple questions, but they were filled with purpose. God wasn't asking because he didn't know the answers. He was asking to give Cain a chance to recognize what was happening inside him. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen into this dark expression? God was giving Cain an opportunity to stop and think, to step back from the edge he was approaching, to see the danger he was in. God was being merciful here. He could have simply let Cain continue down his dark path and face the consequences. But instead, he intervened. He reached out. He asked questions that invited self-reflection. This was an act of grace, a moment where everything could have changed if Cain had responded with honesty and humility. God was essentially saying, Stop. Look at yourself. See what's happening. You still have a choice here. The questions were also gentle in a way. God didn't immediately condemn Cain. He didn't say, You're a terrible person, or I'm disappointed in you. He simply asked why Cain was responding this way. It was an invitation to dialogue, to confession, to repentance. God was giving Cain space to open up, to admit what he was feeling, to ask for help with the darkness growing inside him. But there was also a warning hidden in these questions. By asking why Cain was angry and why his face had fallen, God was pointing out that Cain's response was wrong. The anger wasn't justified. The resentment wasn't appropriate. God was gently showing Cain that his reaction to the rejected offering revealed a problem in his heart that needed to be addressed. The questions were both an offer of help and a warning of danger. Then God said something that has echoed through the centuries, a warning that shows us how sin works. Genesis 4:7 records his words, If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted, and if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. God was telling Cain that acceptance was still possible. If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted. You can still be accepted, Cain. You can still make this right. If you do what is right, if you bring the right offering with the right heart, won't you be accepted just like your brother? The door isn't closed. You're not beyond hope. You can change this situation by changing your heart and your actions. But then came the warning about what would happen if Cain didn't do well, if he continued down this dark path. Sin lieth at the door. This phrase paints a vivid picture. Sin wasn't something far away. It wasn't some distant possibility. It was right there, at the door, waiting. The image is of a dangerous animal crouching at the entrance, ready to pounce the moment the door opens. Sin was that close, that ready, that dangerous. God continued, And unto thee shall be his desire. Sin desires to have you, Cain. It wants to control you, to master you, to destroy you. Sin isn't passive. It's active, aggressive, hungry. It has desires and intentions, and those desires are focused on you. It wants to take over your life, to consume you, to use you for its purposes. This wasn't just a religious concept God was teaching. This was a real warning about a real danger. But God didn't leave Cain without hope. He added, And thou shalt rule over him. You can master sin, Cain. You have the power to control it, to resist it, to overcome it. You're not helpless here. Yes, sin is at the door. Yes, it desires to have you, but you can rule over it. You can say no. You can choose the right path. You have agency, strength, the ability to fight back and win. This was one of the most important moments in human history. God was explaining how sin works, how it waits for opportunity, how it desires to control us, how we have the power to resist it. He was giving Cain both a warning and encouragement. The warning, sin is right there, ready to attack. The encouragement, you can overcome it. Everything was laid out clearly. Cain knew the danger. Cain knew his options. Cain knew he had a choice. God had done everything he could to help Cain without removing his free will. He had asked questions to prompt self-examination. He had explained the path back to acceptance. He had warned about the danger of sin. He had assured Cain that he could overcome. Now it was up to Cain to choose. Would he humble himself and do what was right? Or would he let sin, which was crouching at his door, pounce and take control? After God's warning, something happened between the two brothers. Genesis 4:8 begins, "And Cain talked with Abel, his brother." Cain spoke to Abel. They had a conversation, but the Bible doesn't tell us what Cain said. We don't know his exact words. We don't know if he lied to Abel, if he pretended everything was fine, if he invited Abel somewhere under false pretenses, or if he simply engaged in normal conversation. What we do know is what happened next. The verse continues, "And it came to pass when they were in the field." They went to the field together. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a chance meeting. Cain talked with Abel, and then they ended up in the field. Whether Cain suggested going there or whether it just happened naturally, they found themselves alone together in an open place, away from their parents, away from any witnesses. The field was Cain's territory. This was where he worked every day. He knew this ground. He knew every path, every corner, every hidden spot. Abel, as a shepherd, would have been more comfortable in the open pastures where his flocks grazed. But now he was in Cain's domain, in the place where Cain spent his days fighting against the cursed soil. The isolation was significant. They were alone. No one else was there. No one could see what was about to happen. No one could intervene or stop what was coming. Whether Cain planned this or whether the opportunity simply presented itself, the setting was now perfect for violence. Two brothers, alone in a field with no witnesses except God himself. We can only imagine what was going through Cain's mind at this moment. Had he already decided what he was going to do, or was he still wrestling with the darkness inside him? God's warning was still fresh. The words about sin crouching at the door, desiring to have him, should have been ringing in his ears. He still had time to turn back. He still had the power to rule over sin. But the anger was there too, burning hot, demanding satisfaction. Abel had no idea what was coming. He trusted his brother. Why wouldn't he? They had grown up together. They were family. Whatever Cain had said to him, Abel had believed it enough to go with him to the field. He didn't see the danger. He didn't sense the darkness in his brother's heart. He walked beside Cain, probably talking about ordinary things, completely unaware that these were the last moments of his life. Then it happened. Genesis 4:8 records the terrible moment with stark simplicity. And Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. That's all the Bible says. No detailed description, no explanation of the method, just the awful fact. Cain killed Abel. Cain rose up against Abel his brother. These words show intentionality. Cain rose up, he took action, he made a move, he initiated violence. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a moment of carelessness. Cain deliberately attacked his brother. The phrase "rose up against" suggests sudden, aggressive action. One moment they were together in the field, and the next moment Cain was attacking. And slew him. The Hebrew word here means to kill, to murder, to take life. Cain killed Abel. He took his brother's life. The first human born into this world became the first human to die by another human's hand. Abel, whose name meant breath or vapor, had his breath taken away by his own brother. The temporary nature of his name became tragically prophetic. This was the first murder in human history. Death had entered the world through Adam's sin, but until now, death had been a natural process, something that happened because of the curse, not because one person deliberately took another's life. Cain changed that forever. He introduced a new kind of evil into the world, murder, the intentional killing of another human being. We don't know exactly how Cain killed Abel. The Bible doesn't tell us if he used a rock, a farming tool, his bare hands, or something else. What matters is that he did it. He crossed the line from thinking about violence to committing it. The sin that had been crouching at his door had pounced. It had gotten inside. It had taken control. And now Abel was dead. Think about what this meant. Abel had brought his offering in faith. He had been accepted by God. He had done nothing wrong. And now he was dead, murdered by his own brother in a lonely field. His blood soaked into the same ground that Cain worked every day. The earth that had never tasted human blood before now drank deeply of it. The curse on the ground had just gotten darker. Cain stood there, looking at what he had done. His brother's body lay before him, lifeless. The anger that had driven him to this point must have been mixed now with other feelings. Perhaps shock at his own actions, perhaps fear of consequences, perhaps a desperate hope that somehow this could be undone. But it couldn't. Abel was dead. The first murder had been committed, and there was no taking it back. The sin had won this battle. Cain had not ruled over it as God had told him he could. Instead, sin had ruled over him. It had controlled his actions. It had turned his anger into violence and his violence into murder. The warning God had given was now fulfilled in the worst possible way. The beast at the door had not just entered, it had completely taken over. God came to Cain again, just as he had come to Adam and Eve in the garden after they sinned, just as he had come to Cain before the murder to warn him. Now he came again after the murder to confront him. Genesis 4:9 tells us what happened. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? This question was similar to the one God asked Adam in the garden. When Adam had sinned, God had called out, Where art thou? Now, after Cain had murdered Abel, God asked, Where is Abel thy brother? In both cases, God knew the answer. He didn't need information. He was giving the sinner an opportunity to confess, to tell the truth, to take responsibility for what had happened. Where is Abel, thy brother? Notice how God phrased the question. He didn't just say, Where is Abel? He said, Where is Abel, thy brother? God was emphasizing the relationship. Abel wasn't just someone. He was Cain's brother. They shared the same parents. They grew up together. They were family. God was highlighting the horrible nature of what Cain had done. He had killed his own brother, his own flesh and blood. The question hung in the air. Cain had a choice to make. He could confess. He could say, I killed him. I let my anger control me. I ignored your warning. I did a terrible thing. He could tell the truth and throw himself on God's mercy. That option was still there. God was still giving him a chance to respond with honesty. But Cain had already chosen the path of sin, and sin doesn't stop at one wrong action. Sin leads to more sin. Murder led to lying. Violence led to deception. The darkness that had taken control of Cain wasn't finished with him yet. He had killed his brother, and now he was about to lie to God. God's question was also a test of Cain's heart. Would he repent? Would he confess? Would he show any remorse for what he had done? Or would he continue down the path of rebellion, adding lie upon lie, sin upon sin? The moment was critical. Everything Cain said next would reveal what was truly in his heart. Cain's response was shocking in its boldness and dishonesty. Genesis 4:9 continues with his answer, "And he said, I know not, am I my brother's keeper?" These words revealed just how far Cain had fallen, how completely sin had taken control of his heart and mind. I know not. This was a direct lie. Cain knew exactly where Abel was. Abel was dead in the field where Cain had killed him. But Cain looked God in the face and lied. He pretended ignorance. He acted as if he had no idea what had happened to his brother. This wasn't just a small deception or a half-truth. This was a bold-faced lie told directly to God himself. Think about the audacity of this moment. Cain was lying to the God who knows everything, who sees everything, who was present when the murder happened. God didn't need to ask where Abel was. He already knew, yet Cain thought he could deceive God, or perhaps he simply didn't care anymore. The sin that had driven him to murder had also driven him to the point where he would lie without hesitation, even to his Creator. Then Cain added something even worse. Am I my brother's keeper? This wasn't just a lie. This was defiance. This was sarcasm. This was Cain throwing a question back at God with an attitude of rebellion and contempt. The word keeper was significant. Abel had been a keeper of sheep. Now Cain was mockingly asking if he was supposed to be Abel's keeper, as if his brother were an animal needing supervision. The question itself revealed Cain's twisted thinking. Yes, Cain, you are responsible for your brother. Yes, you are supposed to care about what happens to him. Yes, humans are supposed to look out for each other, especially family members. But Cain was rejecting all of this. He was essentially saying, why should I care what happens to Abel? Why should I be responsible for him? Why are you asking me about him? This response showed that Cain had no remorse. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He wasn't broken over his sin. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. Instead, he was defensive, defiant, dishonest. He was trying to evade responsibility, to avoid consequences, to pretend he had done nothing wrong. The darkness in his heart was complete. Cain's question has become famous throughout history because it reveals a fundamental truth about human responsibility. We are our brother's keeper. We are responsible for how we treat others. We can't just kill someone and then shrug and say, "Not my problem." But Cain was trying to do exactly that, to murder his brother and then act as if he had no responsibility for Abel's welfare or whereabouts. God's response cut through Cain's lies and defiance. Genesis 4:10 records what the Lord said, and he said, "What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." God wasn't fooled by Cain's deception. He knew exactly what had happened, and now he was going to reveal that knowledge. What hast thou done? This question was rhetorical. God knew what Cain had done, but he was forcing Cain to confront the reality of his actions. What have you done, Cain? Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done? Do you grasp the horror of your crime? You've murdered your brother. You've taken a human life. You've spilled innocent blood. What have you done? Then God said something remarkable. The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Abel's blood was crying out. Blood doesn't have a literal voice, of course, but God was using powerful imagery to make a point. The blood that Cain had spilled was speaking. It was testifying. It was crying out for justice. The very earth that had received Abel's blood was bearing witness against Cain. This idea of blood crying out shows us something important about murder and justice. When innocent blood is shed, it demands a response. It cries out to God. Abel couldn't speak anymore. He was dead, but his blood spoke for him. The injustice of his murder wasn't silent. It shouted to heaven. It demanded that God take notice, that God respond, that God bring justice. Crieth unto me from the ground. The blood was crying specifically to God. It was appealing to the ultimate judge, the ultimate authority, the one who had created both Cain and Abel. Cain might have thought he could hide his crime, that because there were no human witnesses, he could get away with murder. but he couldn't hide from God. The blood itself became a witness, crying out from the very ground where it had been spilled. The ground here is significant. This was the same ground that Cain worked as a farmer. This was the ground that had been cursed because of Adam's sin. This was the ground that produced thorns and thistles, that fought against Cain's efforts every day, and now this ground had opened its mouth to receive innocent blood. The earth itself had become complicit in Cain's crime, not by choice but by necessity, and now it was testifying against him. God was telling Cain that there were no secrets, no successful cover-ups, no way to hide. You think you can lie to me? You think you can pretend you don't know where Abel is? His blood is crying out to me right now. The ground is telling me what you did. Everything is known. Everything is seen. You cannot escape the truth. Now this was God's way of completely demolishing Cain's attempts at deception and denial. Now came the judgment. God had confronted Cain's lie. He had revealed that he knew about the murder, and now he was going to pronounce the consequences. Genesis 4:11-12 records God's words. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And now art thou cursed from the earth. Cain was now under a curse, not just living in a cursed world like everyone else, but personally cursed. The ground itself, which had received Abel's blood, was now turning against Cain in a specific and direct way. This was a punishment that fit the crime. Cain had made the earth drink his brother's blood, and now the earth would reject him. Which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. God was describing what had happened in vivid terms. The earth had opened like a mouth, swallowing Abel's blood that poured from his wounds, blood that came from Cain's hand, Cain's direct action. There was no escaping the responsibility. Cain's own hand had shed this blood. Cain's own actions had forced the earth to drink it, and now there would be consequences. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. This was a direct attack on Cain's livelihood and identity. He was a farmer. He was a tiller of the ground. This was his work, his skill, his contribution to the family. But now the ground would refuse to cooperate with him. It wouldn't yield its strength. It wouldn't produce crops for him. The very thing he had dedicated his life to would now be taken away from him. Imagine what this meant for Cain. All those years of learning to farm, of developing his skills, of fighting against the cursed ground to produce food, all of it was now worthless. He could till the soil all he wanted, but nothing would grow. The earth itself would resist him in a way it didn't resist others. His chosen profession, his identity, his purpose, all stripped away as a consequence of his sin. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. But God wasn't finished. Not only would the ground refuse to produce for Cain, but he would also lose his home. He would become a fugitive, someone running from justice, someone with no settled place, someone constantly on the move. He would become a vagabond, a wanderer, someone without roots, someone who belongs nowhere. This was a complete reversal of what Cain had tried to build. He had worked the ground to establish himself, to have a place, to be productive and settled. Now he would have none of that. He would wander endlessly, unable to settle down, unable to call any place home, unable to farm the land that had been his whole life. The earth would reject him. He would be driven from place to place, never finding rest, never finding peace. The curse God pronounced on Cain was severe, but it was also just. Cain had taken his brother's life out of jealousy and anger. He had ignored God's warning. He had given in to sin instead of ruling over it. He had murdered innocent blood and then lied about it. He had shown no remorse, no repentance, only defiance. And now he would face the consequences of his choices. The ground that drank Abel's blood would refuse to serve his murderer. Cain would spend the rest of his life wandering, marked by his crime, separated from the life he had known. God had just pronounced his judgment on Cain. The ground would no longer yield its strength to him, and he would become a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. This was Cain's sentence, his punishment for murdering his brother. The life he had known was over. Everything was about to change in the most drastic way possible. To be a fugitive meant Cain would always be running, always looking over his shoulder, always afraid of being caught or punished. A fugitive has no peace, no security, no sense of safety. Every stranger could be a threat. Every noise in the night could be danger. Cain would live the rest of his life with this constant anxiety, this perpetual fear, this knowledge that he was marked by his crime and couldn't escape what he had done. To be a vagabond meant constant movement with no destination. A vagabond doesn't travel towards something. He just wanders aimlessly from place to place. There's no home to return to, no familiar place to rest, no community to belong to. It's a lonely existence, an empty existence, a life without roots or connections or stability. Cain would experience this restlessness for the remainder of his days on earth. The sentence fit the crime in a poetic way. Cain had been a farmer, someone who stayed in one place, who worked the same fields day after day, who had a settled life tied to the land. Now he would be the opposite. Homeless, landless, unable to farm, unable to settle down. The very thing that had defined him was being stripped away. His identity as a tiller of the ground was being destroyed by his own actions. This wasn't just about physical consequences. The wandering was also spiritual and emotional. Cain would never find rest for his soul. He would carry the weight of his guilt wherever he went. The blood of his brother would haunt him. The memory of what he had done would follow him from place to place. He couldn't outrun his sin. He couldn't escape what he had become. For the first time, Cain showed real emotion beyond anger. He responded to God's judgment with a cry that revealed the weight of what he was facing. Genesis 4:13 tells us, "And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear." This was Cain's protest, his complaint, his expression of how overwhelming the sentence felt to him. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Some translations render this as, my sin is greater than can be forgiven. But either way, Cain was expressing that the weight on him was crushing. He was saying the burden was too heavy, the consequences too severe, the judgment too harsh. He felt overwhelmed by what God had pronounced on him. The reality of his future was sinking in, and it terrified him. This was the closest Cain came to showing remorse, but notice what he focused on. He wasn't saying, what I did to Abel was too terrible. He wasn't saying, I'm so sorry for murdering my brother. He wasn't expressing sorrow for taking an innocent life or for the pain he had caused his family. He was saying, this punishment is too much for me. His concern was still primarily about himself, about his own suffering, about his own future. Then Cain explained why the punishment felt unbearable. Genesis 4:14 records his words in detail. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. Cain listed out everything he was losing and everything he feared about his future. Thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth. Cain understood he was being expelled from the life he knew. Just as his parents had been driven out of Eden, now he was being driven out from his home, his land, his place in the world. He was losing his connection to the earth, to his work, to everything familiar. This was a complete uprooting of his entire existence. And from thy face shall I be hid. This might be the saddest part of Cain's lament. He recognized that his sin had created a separation between him and God. He would be hidden from God's face, not that God couldn't see him, but that the close presence, the direct interaction, the possibility of fellowship would be lost. Cain was acknowledging that his relationship with God was being fundamentally changed by what he had done. "And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth." Cain was simply repeating back what God had already said, but now it was sinking in. Now he was really understanding what this meant. He would wander endlessly. He would have no home. He would belong nowhere. The full weight of this sentence was hitting him, and it was crushing. "And it shall come to pass, that every one that findeth me shall slay me." Here was Cain's greatest fear. He was afraid of revenge. He was afraid that anyone who found him would kill him in retaliation for what he had done to Abel. As a wanderer, he would be vulnerable. He would have no protection, no community to defend him, no walls to hide behind. Think about the irony here. Cain had murdered his brother, and now he was terrified of being murdered himself. He had introduced violence into the human family, and now he was afraid of becoming a victim of that same violence. Despite everything Cain had done, God responded to his fear with mercy. This is remarkable when you think about it. Cain had murdered his brother, lied to God's face, shown no real repentance, and complained about his punishment. Yet God still showed him grace. Genesis 4:15 tells us what happened. "And the Lord said unto him, Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." God made a decree of protection over Cain. Anyone who killed Cain would face vengeance 7 times over. This was a severe warning to anyone who might want to take revenge on Cain for killing Abel. God was essentially saying, Cain's punishment is mine to give. No one else has the right to kill him. If you do, you'll face consequences far worse than what you think you're avenging. The number 7 in the Bible often represents completeness or perfection. Sevenfold vengeance meant complete, total, overwhelming judgment on anyone who harmed Cain. This wasn't a small threat. This was God putting his own authority behind Cain's protection. Murder was wrong when Cain did it to Abel, and it would be wrong if anyone did it to Cain. God was establishing a principle: justice belongs to him, not to human revenge. "And the Lord set a mark upon Cain." God placed some kind of mark or sign on Cain. The Bible doesn't tell us what this mark looked like. Was it visible on his skin? Was it something about his appearance? Was it an aura or presence about him that people could sense? We don't know the details. What we do know is that this mark served a specific purpose, lest any finding him should kill him. The mark was for Cain's protection. It was a sign that warned others not to harm him. Anyone who saw Cain would see this mark and would know that killing him would bring God's judgment on them. The mark identified Cain as someone under God's special decree, not a decree of favor, but a decree that reserved his punishment for God alone. This mark was both a curse and a mercy. It was a curse because it identified Cain as a murderer. Everyone who saw him would know he had done something terrible. He would carry this identification for the rest of his life. He couldn't hide his crime. He couldn't pretend to be innocent. The mark declared his guilt to everyone he met. It was a permanent brand of shame, but it was also a mercy because it protected his life. Cain had feared being killed by anyone who found him, and God addressed that fear directly. The mark ensured that Cain would live, that his life would be preserved, that he wouldn't become a victim of revenge killing. God was protecting the very man who had just committed the first murder. This shows us something profound about God's character. Even in judgment, he includes mercy. Even when punishing sin, he doesn't abandon the sinner completely. With the mark upon him and the sentence pronounced, Cain left. Genesis 4:16 tells us simply but powerfully, "And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden." This was a pivotal moment. Cain's final separation from the life he had known and from fellowship with God. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. This phrase carries enormous weight. Cain physically left the place where God's presence was manifested in a special way. Just as Adam and Eve had been driven out of Eden, now Cain was leaving the area where his family lived, where they worshipped, where they encountered God. He was choosing to go, to distance himself, to leave behind any possibility of close fellowship with the Lord. This departure was both forced and chosen. God had pronounced that Cain would be hidden from his face, but Cain also made the choice to leave. He could have stayed nearby, could have remained on the outskirts of his family's land, could have tried to maintain some connection, but instead he went out completely. He removed himself entirely. He chose isolation over any remaining connection to God's presence. The phrase, "from the presence of the Lord," doesn't mean God couldn't see Cain anymore, or that God wasn't everywhere. God is omnipresent. He's everywhere, at all times. But there are places and times when God manifests his presence in special ways, when he makes himself known more directly. Cain was leaving that place. He was leaving the location where God met with people, where worship happened, where divine encounters occurred, and dwelt in the land of Nod. Cain settled in a place called Nod. The name itself is significant. Nod means wandering in Hebrew, so Cain, who was sentenced to be a wanderer, went to live in the land of wandering. Even the name of the place reflected his punishment and his state. He was a wanderer living in the land of wandering. Everything about his new life reflected what he had become. On the east of Eden. The location is also telling. Eden was where paradise had been, where God had placed Adam and Eve in the beginning. Adam and Eve had been driven east of Eden when they sinned. Now Cain was going even further east, moving further away from where it all started, distancing himself even more from God's original design for humanity. Each generation seemed to move further from Eden, further from the ideal, further from God. Going east in the Bible often symbolizes moving away from God. The sun rises in the east, but moving east from Eden meant moving away from where God's presence had been most fully known. Cain was heading in the direction of separation, of distance, of exile. He was putting physical space between himself and everything holy. Despite God's sentence that Cain would be a wanderer, something interesting happened. Genesis 4:17 tells us, "And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch." Cain got married and had a son, and then he did something that seemed to contradict his sentence as a vagabond. He built a city, and Cain knew his wife. Cain found a wife, and they had relations. The Bible doesn't tell us who this woman was or where she came from. The text assumes we understand that Adam and Eve had many other children besides Cain and Abel. Genesis 5:4 mentions that Adam begat sons and daughters, so there were sisters that Cain could have married. In those early days of humanity, this was necessary to populate the earth. And she conceived and bare Enoch. Cain became a father. His wife gave birth to a son, and Cain named him Enoch. This name means dedicated or initiated. Perhaps Cain saw this son as a new beginning, a fresh start, a chance to build something despite everything that had happened. The birth of his son gave Cain a reason to think about the future, to plan, to create. And he builded a city. Here's where things get interesting. God had said Cain would be a fugitive and a vagabond, a wanderer with no settled home. But Cain built a city, the first city mentioned in the Bible. He was trying to establish permanence, to create security, to build a home that couldn't be taken away. This was Cain's attempt to overcome his curse through his own effort and determination. Think about what building a city meant. A city is the opposite of wandering. A city is settled, permanent, secure. A city has walls for protection, houses for shelter, a community for support. By building a city, Cain was essentially trying to create what God had taken away. He was fighting against his sentence, trying to establish himself despite being under a curse, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Cain named the city after his son. This shows us something about what mattered to Cain. He wanted to create a legacy. He wanted his family line to be remembered. He wanted to build something that would last beyond his own life. The city was his attempt at immortality, at making a name for himself and his descendants. Cain's family line continued and grew. The Bible gives us a brief genealogy of his descendants, showing how his family multiplied and developed. Genesis 4:18 begins the list. And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mehujael, and Mehujael begat Methusael, and Methusael begat Lamech. These names represent several generations of Cain's family line. Each of these names represents a person, a life, a story. Enoch had a son named Irad. Irad had a son named Mehujael. Mehujael had a son named Methusael. Methusael had a son named Lamech. The family was growing, multiplying, continuing despite the curse that hung over their ancestor. Life went on. Children were born. Families were formed. The curse didn't stop Cain's line from reproducing and spreading. Then we get more detail about Lamech, who was several generations down from Cain. Genesis 4:19 tells us, and Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. Lamech did something that hadn't been mentioned before. He took 2 wives. This was the first recorded instance of polygamy in the Bible, having multiple wives at the same time. God's original design was 1 man and 1 woman, Adam and Eve. But here in Cain's line, we see that design being abandoned. Lamech decided that 1 wife wasn't enough. He wanted 2. This shows how far human society had drifted from God's original plan. First murder, now polygamy. Sin was spreading, changing how people lived and related to each other. Lamech's 2 wives had children, and these children became significant. Genesis 4:20-22 gives us details. And Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Jabal, Lamech's son through Ada, became important in developing nomadic life with livestock. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. This means he pioneered or perfected the lifestyle of moving from place to place with herds of animals, living in portable tents rather than permanent structures. Jubal, Jabal's brother, became important in developing music. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. He invented or perfected musical instruments, teaching people how to make and play them. Music became part of human culture through this descendant of Cain. Art and beauty were being created even in a cursed world. Tubal-Cain, Lamech's son through his other wife Zillah, became important in metalworking. He was an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. He taught people how to work with metal, how to forge tools and weapons, how to shape bronze and iron into useful objects. This was a huge advancement in human technology and capability. These 3 men, Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain, represent the development of human civilization. Livestock management, music and art, metalworking and tools, these are the foundations of advanced society. And they all came from Cain's line. The descendants of the first murderer were advancing human culture, developing technology, creating art, building civilization. Despite the curse, despite the separation from God, human ingenuity and creativity continued. Then we come to one of the darkest moments in Cain's family line. Lamech, the descendant of Cain, did something that showed how violence had multiplied since Cain's original murder. Genesis 4:23-24 records a song that Lamech sang to his wives. And Lamech said unto his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. Ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. And Lamech said unto his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. Ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. Lamech was making a formal announcement to both his wives. He wanted them to listen carefully to what he was about to say. He was proud of what he was going to tell them. He wanted them to hear and understand. This wasn't a confession of guilt. This was a boast. For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. Lamech had killed someone. The way this is phrased in Hebrew poetry, it's probably referring to one person described two ways. A man who had wounded Lamech. Someone had hurt Lamech, had injured him in some way, and Lamech's response was to kill him. This wasn't self-defense in the moment. This was revenge. Think about how this compares to Cain. Cain had murdered Abel out of jealousy over a rejected offering. There was no physical attack involved. Abel hadn't hurt Cain physically, but Lamech killed someone who had actually wounded him. On the surface, Lamech's violence might seem more justified. At least he was responding to being hurt. But that's exactly the problem. Lamech thought his revenge was justified. He thought he had a right to kill someone for hurting him. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Here's where Lamech's pride and violence really showed. He was referencing God's protection over Cain. God had said that anyone who killed Cain would be avenged sevenfold. But Lamech was claiming something greater for himself. He was saying that anyone who dared to take revenge on him for his murder would face vengeance 77 times. Lamech was essentially saying, Cain had sevenfold protection. Well, I claim 77-fold protection. I'm more protected than Cain. I'm more dangerous than Cain. Don't mess with me, because the consequences will be far worse than what Cain's murderer would face. This was pure arrogance. This was Lamech putting himself above God's decree, claiming for himself a protection that God had never granted him. The poem also shows how violence had escalated. Cain had murdered without physical provocation. Now, several generations later, Lamech was murdering and boasting about it. He was singing songs about his violence. He was proud of killing someone. He was warning others not to cross him, or they'd face even greater wrath. Violence had gone from a single act of murder to a celebrated part of the culture. The story of Cain ends in the Bible without a neat conclusion, but the consequences of his actions rippled forward through time. The pattern Cain established, jealousy leading to anger, anger leading to murder, murder leading to more violence, became part of the human story. His descendants built cities and advanced civilization, but they did so apart from God, carrying forward a legacy of violence and pride. Cain's life demonstrated fundamental truths about sin and its effects. Sin doesn't stay small, it grows. One act of jealousy led to murder. One murder led to a culture of violence. Lamech's song showed how what began with Cain had multiplied by his time. The progression was clear. Sin breeds more sin, violence breeds more violence, separation from God breeds more separation. Cain's attempt to build security apart from God through his city showed another ongoing human pattern. People try to create meaning, safety, and permanence through their own efforts when separated from God. They build cities, monuments, civilizations. They advance technology, create art, develop culture, and these things aren't evil in themselves. Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain made real contributions to human life. But doing all of this apart from God, without his blessing, in rebellion against his design, meant something essential was always missing. The mark God placed on Cain served as a lasting reminder. Protection mixed with shame. Life preserved but under a curse. Mercy mingled with judgment. Cain got to live, but he lived as a marked man, a wanderer in the land of wandering, separated from God's presence, unable to do the work he had devoted his life to. He built a city, had a family, started a lineage, but he did all of it away from God, and that absence colored everything. The line of Cain eventually faded from the biblical narrative. Genesis chapter 5 starts over with Adam's genealogy through a different son, Seth, who was born to replace Abel. Genesis 4:25 says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew." The godly line, the line that would eventually lead to Noah and save humanity from the flood, came through Seth, not Cain. Cain's story became a warning for all future generations. 1 John 3:12 later refers to him as an example of what not to be. Not as Cain, who was of that wicked one and slew his brother, and wherefore slew he him, because his own works were evil and his brother's righteous. Hebrews 11:4 contrasts Abel's faith with Cain's lack of it. Jude 11 warns about the way of Cain. His name became synonymous with jealousy, violence, and rebellion against God. The first human born into this world became the first murderer. The firstborn became the cursed. The farmer became the wanderer. The brother became the killer. Cain's life was a tragedy of choices, choosing anger over repentance, violence over self-control, defiance over humility, separation over fellowship with God. Every choice led him further down a path that ended in wandering, in exile, in building a life apart from his Creator. If this story impacted you, if it made you think, if it helped you understand the Bible better, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another biblical story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Cain's warning. Leave a comment below telling me what struck you most about this story. Remember, unlike Cain, we still have the chance to choose differently. We can choose repentance over pride, humility over defiance, and fellowship with God over wandering alone. Until next time, may God bless you and keep you.